Yashikov to Rabbi Englander and to Cantor Boaz and to Shula once again. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Yesterday, before Shabbat began, I participated, as is a custom my custom, with the youngest children in the congregation, the toddlers and their parents, in a program called Ahavat Shabbat. We don't do it in person these days, but we're doing it on Zoom. And everyone was in their backyard with cell phones and with laptops. And there's a wonderful little celebration that takes place, and it was really beautiful. Yesterday, the focus was on grandparents. And I was fortunate, and as I mentioned last night, and really happy to be able to be not just a rabbi, but a grandfather in that context, as my kids and daughter and granddaughter from Brooklyn were in the program. And I'm happy to report that she loved it. Anyway, it was about grandparents, and it was about the capacity of grandparents to bless. And so, whereas each time we meet someplace before we do Kiddush, we bless the children with Birkat Kohanim. This time, grandparents were there with their children and with their grandchildren. And they blessed 2 generations. And it was really a lovely experience. I've often thought about the role that grandparents play in the religious lives of grandchildren. And I happen to believe that in many cases, not always, but in many cases, grandparents have the ability to pass on a spirit and a connection to the past, unlike that which parents either are able to do or desirous of doing. Because parents are so busy in the stuff of life, they're busy with their jobs, they're busy with their chores, they're busy taking care of their homes and their children, etc. And to be able to sit back and to give time to matters of the soul or matters of the spirit feels like quite a luxury. But grandparents have more of that time. And grandparents also bring some perspective because of the amount of time that they have lived and because of the experiences which they have had. And so it was really lovely to join with other grandparents in blessing not only the children, but also being able to bless grandchildren together. So I had a wonderful relationship with my grandmother, who we called Nana. And I'd like to talk about her for a moment. My 3 other grandparents were no longer alive when I was born. And so she was my only grandparent. And she was from Germany. They had immigrated from Germany in December 31st, 1937. My grandmother and my grandfather and their 2 daughters, including my mother. They're referred to as Yekes. And I don't know how many of you know that name. Certainly the Israelis know what a Yekka is, and many of the Americans here may know also. But a Yekka is a German Jew, but it's a particular type of German Jew. My grandmother was observant, and she was deeply religious. I knew that connection that she had from her words and the way she lived her life. And one of my favorite things to do as a little child was sit next to her in shul. But a Yekka also has many of the qualities of German culture. So she was very precise, she was very orderly, and she was very punctual. Not to mention that everything had to be perfectly clean. As little kids, we used to laugh about her floors. We would laugh about them because they were so clean. But they also have those expectations for those around them also. I will say that you shouldn't think she wasn't particularly warm and friendly and embracing, because she was all of that. She had a very strong impact, as I mentioned, on my spiritual and my religious development and my identity in so many different ways. I mention her now, and it has nothing to do with the specifics of observance, but I mention her now because of 3 qualities that she brought and that impacted me. And I'm mentioning those qualities because they speak to me particularly this week, not only because of the Ahavat Shabbat program that I did with grandparents last night, but also because of what's going on in the world around us and because of the Parsha that we read. So one thing she was known for certain phrases, certain expressions, and I'm sure each one of you, when you think of your parents or your grandparents, you know there were certain things that they would repeat a lot. My grandmother would say, "Genuch is genuch," and that is enough as enough. Enough is enough. And she might say it in relation to her grandchildren playing and getting a little bit out of control, or she might say it if she had given me like 2 pieces of her delicious pastries or 2 bowls of ice cream, and she would say, "Genuch is genuch, enough is enough." But I know that it had to do with more than a child's behavior. I know it spoke to something about human behavior and human limitation. In Parashat Teitzei, we see a whole series of mitzvot that are meant to create boundaries. They're meant to limit human behavior. And I think in some ways, most laws are just about that, about creating boundaries to limit human behavior. These laws come from an ancient time, but so many of them are applicable today, and so many of them should speak to aspects of human desire and the inclinations to do certain things, including those which come from the Yetzer Ra. And we have to understand when we have limitations on our behaviors and when there needs to be limitations on our desires. We have to be able to say, "Genuch is genuch." These boundaries we find develop respect between people, respect between different communities, respect between men and women, respect between husbands and wives, respect between parents and children, and even a sense that there must be a limitation in terms of what it is we take, what it is we want, right? What it is that we possess. Genuch is genuch. And I was thinking about that in relation to today's political conversation. I was thinking about it in particular to how we view the way that we will vote, because so many people have spoken to me about the whole notion of not wanting to be taxed more. And I really believe that when we go to vote, we can no longer think of it only in terms of what's best for me, or how do I acquire more and more and more. We have to be able to understand when we say, "Genuch is genuch," because genuch is genuch has an implication for how we are in relation to others. It has an implication for all people, not just ourselves. And I think that has to be the vision that we bring in this political climate, in this political season. And another implication was also taught by my grandmother, and it is related to this. It's related to the notion of self-control. Self-control as a Jewish ideal. It's also reflected in human dignity. I remember her once in a conversation about kashrut saying a lot of modern people think that we keep kosher for the reasons that are given in earlier times. And she said, it's not just that. She said, we also learn to keep kosher because it teaches us as human beings that at times we have to control ourselves. And so every time, she said, when we go to a restaurant, you know that you have to exercise self-control. What a wonderful, wonderful way of looking at it. It's not the only reason, but it really made a lot of sense to me even as a kid. And I realized that you can raise up an aspect of humanity and a divine component of ourselves. It's very clear in the beginning of this parsha that begins, Ki Teitzei l'milchama al oivecha. When you go to war against your enemies, And that's followed by a whole series of laws that have to do with the way one treats a captive woman. We know in the world to this day, and we know certainly historically, how women were abused when they were captives. And this law comes to say, and it's early in terms of its conception, but it comes to say that you can't take advantage of a woman when you go to war. You have to control those things that you may desire. Self-control becomes a critical component of living a life of holiness. We control our passions. And as I said, it brings dignity to our lives and how important it is to be dignified human beings. And then I have a final thing to tell you about what she taught me. Having come from Germany and having had lived a really wonderful life there until the Nazis came to power, and having had everything that they owned taken away from them when they came to America. My grandfather had a successful factory. They lost that. My grandmother lived a really good life. And then she came to America. My grandfather got sick and she had to go to work in a factory where she worked until she was in her early 70s, keeping herself busy and productive and serving as a model to her grandchildren. Anyway, when I would speak to her, and she was someone who would speak about her experiences in Germany, and she was someone who would really think about it in the context of history, and that really made her special too. And I would speak to her about how it happened, and she would say, we know that the Nazis were evil. And she also recognized the fact that she had neighbors who were not Jewish, who were good people, some of whom she stayed in touch with until the very end of her life. But she also recognized, as Jewish thinkers, philosophers of the Holocaust, theologians of the Holocaust say, that it wasn't just because of the Nazis, but she said it was because of those people who did nothing. Those people who did nothing because they were afraid or they were apathetic. She said they were the enablers that allowed it to happen. And I'm sure that she said that to me based on her own perceptions and not having read some of the literature of Holocaust thinking or the philosophy of these things. But she understood that most people are apathetic and do nothing. I mean, I think that was part of her brilliance in getting the family out, whereas so many people did not leave in time. But she saw what was coming and she understood Jewish history. Well, in this parsha, there is a pasuk that goes like this, and I taught it a few times this week already. The pasuk is Lo tuchal hitalaim, and it means you should not stand idly by. In Teitzei, it's used in reference to returning lost property. In other words, what it's saying is if you find something which is lost, we don't say, finders, keepers, losers, weepers. That is not a Jewish notion. You got to do everything you can to find the owner of the property, be it an animal or be it something, a material possession, because that person may be suffering right now without that which he or she needs. And so we don't just stand by, we get active in trying to fix things. We're actively engaged in trying to make the world better, but even make people's lives better, safer, help protect people. It's not just about me. It's not for all of us. And we all have to say that. It's not just about me. It's about all of us. So Al Tuchal Hitaleim clearly was seen this past week by in what we witnessed the players of the National Basketball Association do, followed by Major League Baseball players and soccer players and women's NBA players and even hockey players. They all stood up and they said, we're not going to play for a while because there's an injustice taking place in this society that needs to be fixed, that needs to be addressed. And they met with the owners, and the owners are people who have much greater power than these players do. And they got some concessions, not for them, but for us, for this country. Included in those concessions is that every arena in major urban areas is going to be open and made into polling places. People in the cities will be able to vote in a place where they know it'll be safe, right? In a place that will be able to accept lots and lots of people, and it will be done orderly. It was an extraordinary thing. They were saying, we just can't play basketball. They gave up their money to do this. Many of them gave up hundreds of thousands of dollars to do this. And it's going to make a dramatic difference in the ability for all Americans to be able to vote. And there were other concessions they received also. We can never be indifferent. When we're called upon to speak up, when we're called upon to act, we have to be involved. We have to help make the changes that are necessary. For me and for my immigrant Nana, she says to me, you can be better. You can do more. Genuch is genuch. Enough is enough. And it's time to realize that all of us need to be healed, that all of us need to be healed together. Shabbat Shalom. We'll turn to page 155 as we turn to the Musaf service.